The aroma of fresh-baked croissants and brewing coffee drifted through the early morning air as Mrs. Chen stood across the street from La Maison, her newest acquisition. The historic red brick building with its elegant French windows had been a downtown landmark for over 50 years, and now it was hers. She couldn't help but smile, remembering her journey from washing dishes in her parents' small takeout shop to owning one of the city's most prestigious restaurants. The sun was just peeking over the city skyline as she watched her staff arrive for the morning shift. Each one nodded respectfully to the restaurant's manager, unaware that the quiet woman observing from across the street was their new owner. Mrs. Chen had purposely kept the ownership transition quiet, wanting to see the true colors of the establishment she'd worked so hard to acquire. 20 years earlier, she had started with a food truck, serving fusion cuisine that blended her family's traditional recipes with modern flavors. Her dedication to quality and genuine connection with customers had turned that single truck into a successful chain of casual dining spots. But La Maison, this was different. This was proving that excellence knew no boundaries. She recalled the negotiations with the previous owner, Mr. Thompson. He'd been skeptical at first, questioning whether she understood the caliber of establishment La Maison represented. His thinly veiled doubts about her ability to maintain the restaurant's prestigious reputation only strengthened her resolve. After presenting her impressive portfolio, current restaurant holdings, and a check that exceeded his asking price, he had no choice but to sell. The morning light caught the gold lettering on the windows, and Mrs. Chen felt a flutter of pride in her chest. She'd kept the original staff, including the manager, not wanting to disrupt the restaurant's operations. Her business philosophy had always been simple: observe first, then make changes where needed. And so far, her observations had been interesting. From her casual visits to the neighborhood, she'd noticed patterns in who was welcomed warmly and who was told they needed reservations. She'd seen the subtle differences in how staff treated various customers, always maintaining plausible deniability, but clear enough to those who knew what to look for. Standing there in her designer blazer and comfortable flats, Mrs. Chen thought about her own children, now in high school. She wanted them to see that change didn't always have to come through confrontation. Sometimes, the most powerful statements were made quietly, with dignity and strategic thinking. They needed to understand that success wasn't just about making money. It was about creating spaces where everyone could experience excellence. A delivery truck pulled up, breaking her reverie. The driver, an older man with gray hair, struggled with a heavy box of produce. Without hesitation, Mrs. Chen crossed the street to help him, even though she was dressed for a business meeting. The driver thanked her, assuming she was just a kind passerby. Little did he know he was being helped by the owner of not just this restaurant, but 5 others across the city. As the morning rush began and people hurried past on their way to work, Mrs. Chen made a decision. This Sunday, she would bring her family to brunch. Not as the owner, not to make a statement, but as regular customers wanting to enjoy a good meal. How the staff handled that would tell her everything she needed to know about the changes needed at La Maison. After all, a restaurant's true character wasn't in its fancy menu or expensive wine list. It was in how it treated every single person who walked through its doors. Sunday morning arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind that made everyone want to enjoy a leisurely brunch. Mrs. Chen stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her silk scarf. She had deliberately chosen a casual but elegant outfit. Nothing too flashy that would draw attention, but nice enough for La Maison's upscale atmosphere. Down the hall, she could hear her children getting ready, excited about trying the famous French toast they'd heard so much about. Her husband called up from downstairs, "Are you sure about this? We could just go to one of our own restaurants." She understood his concern. They'd been through similar situations before, those uncomfortable moments when people's true colors showed through their polite masks. But this was different. This wasn't just about having brunch. It was about understanding what her customers might experience. As they drove downtown, Their teenage daughter chatted about her upcoming science project, while their younger son pressed his face against the window, counting red cars. It was just another Sunday morning, a family heading out for brunch. Mrs. Chen felt her stomach tighten slightly as they approached the restaurant. Not from fear. She'd faced too much in building her business empire to fear anything anymore, but from anticipation. The street was quieter than usual, with just a few early birds heading to the coffee shop next door. Le Maison's windows gleamed in the morning sun, and through them, Mrs. Chen could see several empty tables despite the busy brunch hours sign displayed prominently on the door. She'd been monitoring the restaurant's reservation system, a perk of ownership, and knew exactly how many tables were actually reserved. Her husband found a parking spot right in front, which felt like a good sign. As they stepped out of their car, Mrs. Chen watched her children's faces light up at the sight of the elegant building. They'd heard stories about this place from their friends at school, about special occasion dinners and celebration brunches. Now they were finally going to experience it themselves. Walking toward the entrance, Mrs. Chen noticed small details she'd missed during her previous observations. The fresh flowers in the window boxes, the perfectly polished brass handles, the slight squeak of the door that needed oiling. All these little things that made up the character of the place she now owned, though only a handful of people knew that fact. Her son reached for the door first, always eager to act grown-up by holding it open for everyone. Mrs. Chen caught a glimpse of their reflection in the glass. A well-dressed family, ready for a nice Sunday brunch. In her mind, she ran through the possible scenarios of what might happen next. She'd spent the past month collecting stories from various customers, learning about their experiences, both good and bad. The host stand was empty when they walked in, but she could hear voices from the kitchen and the clink of coffee cups from the dining room. The familiar scent of freshly baked pastries filled the air, making her son whisper, "It smells amazing." His innocent excitement made her even more determined to ensure this place would become somewhere that welcomed everyone with the same warmth. She heard footsteps approaching from the dining room. The manager, right on time for his usual Sunday morning shift. Her children were still gazing around at the crystal chandeliers and elegant table settings, completely unaware of the subtle tension building in their mother's shoulders. Her husband gently placed his hand on her back, a quiet gesture of support. This moment, Mrs. Chen realized, would reveal more than just how her family would be treated. It would show her exactly what needed to change in her new restaurant, and how to make those changes happen. As the manager's footsteps grew closer, she took a deep breath and reminded herself that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments. The manager appeared from around the corner, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His practiced smile flickered as he took in the family standing in the entrance. Mrs. Chen noticed how his eyes darted past them to check if anyone else was waiting behind them. How his posture shifted ever so slightly. "Good morning," he said, his tone professional but cool. "Do you have a reservation?" He clutched his tablet tightly, though Mrs. Chen knew he hadn't even glanced at it to check. "No, we don't," she replied calmly, watching as her children's excited expressions began to fade. But we noticed several empty tables as we walked in. The manager cleared his throat, glancing at his tablet for the first time. I'm terribly sorry, but we're fully booked for brunch today. All these tables are reserved for our regular customers, who should be arriving shortly." He gestured vaguely toward the dining room. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the diner down the street." Just then, the front door chimed. A couple walked in, dressed similarly to Mrs. Chen's family. The manager's demeanor transformed instantly, his smile warming as he turned to greet them. "Welcome. Just two for brunch today?" "Yes," the woman replied. "We don't have a reservation, but—" "Oh, that's no problem at all. We always have room for walk-ins. Right this way, please." He grabbed two menus, completely ignoring Mrs. Chen's family as he started to lead the couple to a table. Mrs. Chen's daughter tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, why did they get a table?" she whispered, confusion clear in her voice. Her son had stopped bouncing with excitement and was now standing very still, looking at his shoes. These were the moments that changed children. Mrs. Chen knew, the first times they encountered such treatment, when they started to understand certain ugly truths about the world. Her husband shifted beside her, his jaw tightening. She could feel his anger, carefully controlled but building. Before he could speak, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "I've got this." "Sir," she called out to the manager, her voice clear and steady. "Could we speak privately for a moment?" The manager paused, looking annoyed at the interruption. "Ma'am," as I explained, "we're fully booked. I can recommend several other establishments that might be more suitable." "I insist," Mrs. Chen replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your office would be perfect for this conversation. It's just down that hallway, second door on the right, correct?" His face flickered with confusion at her knowledge of the layout. How did you?" "My children," she said, turning to her family with a warm smile. "Why don't you and Dad check out the beautiful garden patio I've told you about? This won't take long." Her husband nodded, understanding in his eyes as he led the children toward the patio. He'd seen that look on his wife's face before, the same one she'd worn when negotiating her first business loan, when facing down competitors who underestimated her, when building her restaurant empire piece by piece. The manager stood frozen for a moment, then gestured stiffly toward his office. As they walked, Mrs. Chen noticed other staff members watching curiously. Good, she thought. This lesson wouldn't be just for the manager. Inside the office, she waited for him to close the door before speaking. She didn't raise her voice or show anger. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small folder. "I've been watching my restaurant for the past month," she said quietly, placing her ownership documents on his desk. "And I have to say, I'm disappointed in what I've seen." The color drained from the manager's face as he stared at the papers, realization dawning in his eyes. The perfect Sunday brunch service he planned was about to become something very different. A lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of hospitality. The manager sank into his office chair, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at the ownership documents. Outside, the usual Sunday brunch chatter filtered through the door, a stark contrast to the heavy silence in the room. Mrs. Chen remained standing, calm, and composed as she pulled out a second folder. "Let me show you something interesting," she said, her voice steady and clear. "These are reports from mystery diners over the past month. Different people, different times, different days of the week." She laid out several papers on his desk. "Notice any patterns?" His eyes scanned the documents, and she could see the moment understanding hit him. The reports showed a clear pattern. Families of color being turned away during slow periods, solo diners being seated at less desirable tables, varying wait times for different customers despite similar circumstances. I can explain," he stammered, but Mrs. Chen held up her hand. "Before you do, there's more." She pulled out her phone and showed him the reservation system's data for that morning. "Right now, we have 12 empty tables. The system shows only 4 reservations for the next hour. Would you like to explain why you told my family we were fully booked?" The manager's face flushed red, then pale. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. The sounds of clinking cutlery and quiet conversation continued to drift in from the dining room, a reminder that business was going on as usual just outside the door. "You know," Mrs. Chen continued, pulling up a chair and sitting down, "when I bought this restaurant, I read through its history. Did you know it was one of the first establishments in this city to integrate its dining room in the 1960s? The original owner faced threats and boycotts, but he stood firm because he believed everyone deserved to enjoy good food in a beautiful space." She paused, letting her words sink in. Through the office window, she could see her children in the garden patio, their father pointing out the flowering plants to keep them distracted. Her heart ached thinking about the confusion in their eyes earlier. I didn't buy La Maison just because it's profitable, she said, turning back to the manager. I bought it because of its history, its reputation for excellence, and its potential to be something even greater. But excellence isn't just about the food or the service, it's about dignity. It's about making every single person who walks through that door feel valued. The manager shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Chen, I never meant to. He began, but stopped, realizing how hollow any excuse would sound. Here's what's going to happen now, she said, leaning forward slightly. First, you're going to go out there and seat my family at our best table. Then, you're going to serve them the most amazing brunch they've ever had. And after that, she pulled out one final document from her bag. After that, we're going to have a serious discussion about the future. I've prepared 2 documents, a resignation letter and a new contract. The contract includes mandatory training in inclusive hospitality and a 6-month probation period under my direct supervision. The choice is yours. Standing up, she straightened her scarf and walked to the office door. I believe people can change, she said, her hand on the doorknob. I've seen it happen. But change only comes when we acknowledge our mistakes and actively work to do better. You have 15 minutes to decide which document you'll be signing. As she walked back to join her family in the garden, she could feel the eyes of the staff following her. Word had clearly spread about what was happening in the manager's office. Good, she thought. Sometimes the most powerful lessons weren't just for one person, but for everyone who witnessed them. Her son spotted her first, waving excitedly. Mom, come look at these flowers. She smiled, heading toward them. Sometimes the best way to change the world was one restaurant, one moment, one person at a time. Exactly 15 minutes later, a knock on the garden door drew Mrs. Chen's attention. The manager stood there, holding a single document in his trembling hands. His face showed signs of someone who had done some hard thinking in a very short time. Behind him, several staff members pretended to be busy while clearly trying to watch what was happening. Mrs. Chen, he said softly, I've made my decision. He held out the new contract, not the resignation letter. And I owe your family an apology, a real one. Mrs. Chen studied his face for a moment. In her years of business, she'd become good at reading people, at seeing the difference between genuine remorse and mere embarrassment at being caught. What she saw in his eyes gave her hope. Then let's start over, she said, gesturing to her family. This is my husband, a professor of engineering. These are our children, both honor roll students who've been excited all week to try your famous French toast. The manager turned to face her family, and for the first time that morning, he really looked at them. Not as unwanted guests to be turned away, but as people. A family excited about sharing a meal together. The shame on his face was visible as he bowed slightly. I am truly sorry for my behavior earlier, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Please, allow me to make it right. We have a wonderful table by the window, if you'd like to follow me. As they walked through the restaurant, Mrs. Chen noticed the subtle shifts in the atmosphere. Staff members who had been avoiding eye contact earlier now stood straighter, watching their manager lead by example. The couple who had been seated before them looked uncomfortable, perhaps realizing what they had witnessed. At the table, the manager himself pulled out chairs and placed napkins in laps. He personally handed them menus, his hands still shaking slightly. Everything is on the house today, he started to say, but Mrs. Chen cut him off gently. No, she said firmly but kindly. We'll pay full price, just like any other customers. Because that's what we are today, customers who deserve the same respect and service as everyone else. Her daughter looked up from her menu, curiosity bright in her eyes. Mom, can I try the crepes with berries? The simple question, so normal and innocent, seemed to hit the manager hard. He had almost denied this child, this family, such a simple pleasure. The crepes are excellent, he said, finding his professional voice again. Our chef makes the sauce fresh every morning. He paused, then added, Actually, if you're interested, I could ask him to show you how he makes it. He loves teaching young people about cooking. Mrs. Chen watched as her children's faces lit up at the offer. This was how change began, not with grand gestures, but with small moments of genuine connection. She nodded her approval, and the manager hurried off to the kitchen, walking with a different kind of purpose than he'd shown earlier. Through the window, sunlight streamed in, catching the crystal water glasses and creating tiny rainbows on the white tablecloth. Her husband reached under the table and squeezed her hand, a gesture that said more than words could. They turned what could have been a horrible morning into something meaningful, something their children would remember for the right reasons. A young waitress approached their table, her smile genuine as she poured water and described the specials. Around them, other customers were being seated, the normal rhythm of a Sunday brunch service continuing. But something had shifted in the air, something important that went beyond just this one family or this one restaurant. Mrs. Chen took a sip of water and smiled. Sometimes the best way to run a business wasn't just about profits or prestige. Sometimes it was about creating spaces where dignity and respect were served right alongside the French toast and coffee. As promised, the chef emerged from the kitchen, wearing his white coat and carrying a small basket of fresh berries. His weathered face broke into a warm smile as he approached their table. Unlike the manager's earlier forced politeness, this was genuine, the joy of someone who truly loved sharing his craft. I hear we have some young food enthusiasts who want to learn about crepe making, he said, pulling up a chair at their table's empty side. Mrs. Chen watched as her children leaned forward eagerly, their earlier discomfort forgotten in the face of this new adventure. The chef spread a clean napkin on the table and arranged some berries on it. You see, he explained, the secret isn't just in the cooking. It's in choosing the perfect berries. Feel this one, he said, handing a plump raspberry to her daughter. Notice how it's firm, but not hard? That's what we look for. From her seat, Mrs. Chen could see the manager watching from near the kitchen, a thoughtful expression on his face. He was seeing what she had known all along. That magic happened when you gave people a chance, when you looked past your preconceptions and saw the humanity in others. Other diners were watching too, some smiling at the impromptu cooking lesson taking place. A small girl at a nearby table tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking if she could learn about crepes too. Without hesitation, the chef waved her over, pulling up another chair. The more the merrier, he said, now arranging berries for both children to examine. You know, in my kitchen, we have a saying. Good food brings people together. It doesn't matter where you're from or what you look like. Everyone smiles in the same language when they taste something delicious. Mrs. Chen caught the manager's eye and gestured for him to join them. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over, standing awkwardly at first. The chef looked up at him and smiled. Would you like to learn too? In all these years, I don't think I've ever shown you how we make the sauce. Something in the manager's face softened. I'd like that, he said quietly, pulling up another chair. Soon he was just another student in the chef's impromptu class, learning alongside the children about the perfect berry-to-sugar ratio for the sauce. As the lesson continued, more staff members drifted over during their free moments, adding their own tips and stories. The young waitress mentioned her grandmother's secret recipe for whipped cream. A busboy shared how his mother made similar crepes in his home country, but with different fruits. The restaurant had transformed. What started as a tense morning had become something beautiful. A gathering of people sharing stories and knowledge, breaking down walls one berry at a time. Mrs. Chen's husband squeezed her hand under the table again, both of them watching their children absorb not just cooking tips, but a larger lesson of how the world could be. You know, the chef said, wrapping up his lesson, every morning when I come in to cook, I think about all the people who will sit at these tables. Every plate that leaves my kitchen is a chance to make someone's day better, to give them a moment of joy. That's what food is really about." The manager nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just learning about crepe sauce. He was learning about service, about the true meaning of hospitality, about seeing each customer as a person with their own stories and dreams, worthy of respect and kindness. Mrs. Chen watched as her son carefully arranged berries on a napkin, trying to recreate the chef's pattern. Her daughter was taking notes on a paper napkin, determined to remember every detail. This was more than just a Sunday brunch now. It was a moment of change, a lesson in humanity that would stick with everyone present. Through the windows, the morning sun had risen higher, casting a warm glow over the dining room. The atmosphere had shifted from tense to welcoming, from exclusive to inclusive. This, Mrs. Chen thought, was exactly what she had hoped for when she bought La Maison, not just a restaurant, but a place where barriers could fall and communities could grow. After the cooking lesson, as their plates of perfectly prepared crepes arrived at the table, Mrs. Chen noticed something remarkable happening throughout the restaurant. The invisible walls that often divided fine dining spaces had begun to crumble. The manager, who had started the morning turning people away, was now personally greeting every guest who walked through the door with genuine warmth. "You should have seen my first attempt at making crepes," he was telling a young family who had just arrived without reservations. The chef had to scrape it off the ceiling. His laughter was real now, not the polite chuckle he'd used earlier. "Let me find you a wonderful table near the window." Mrs. Chen's children were still buzzing with excitement from their cooking lesson, eager to share their new knowledge. "Dad, did you know you have to tilt the pan in a circle to make the batter spread just right?" her son explained, demonstrating with his hands. Her daughter was already planning to practice making crepes at home. The chef had returned to his kitchen, but his impact lingered. Other diners were talking across tables now, sharing stories about their own favorite foods and family recipes. The usual hushed atmosphere of upscale dining had been replaced by something warmer, more inclusive. An elderly couple at the next table smiled at Mrs. Chen's family. "We've been coming here for 20 years, the woman said, leaning over slightly, "but we've never seen anything quite like this. It's wonderful." Her husband nodded in agreement, adding, "Food tastes better when there's joy in the air." The manager approached their table again, this time carrying a small notebook. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his voice steady with new purpose, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about dignity and value." He opened the notebook, revealing pages of hastily written notes. "I have some ideas for changes we could make, if you're willing to hear them." She gestured to an empty chair, and he sat down, spreading his notes on the table. "First," he said, "I think we should start a Sunday cooking class for kids. The chef is clearly wonderful with children, and it could help make fine dining less intimidating for families." His eyes were bright with enthusiasm now, the earlier shame replaced by hope. "And look at this," he continued, flipping to another page. "We could partner with local community centers, offer internships to young people interested in the restaurant industry. Give them the same chances I was given when I started." He paused, looking around the now buzzing dining room. "Everyone deserves a seat at the table." Mrs. Chen's husband, who had been quietly observing all morning, spoke up. "You know, my university's international student program is always looking for places where new students can feel welcome. Sometimes it's hard for them to find restaurants that feel like home." The manager immediately started writing in his notebook again. "We could create special welcome events, maybe have international cuisine nights where our chef collaborates with local home cooks." His voice trailed off as he scribbled more ideas. A young waitress appeared with fresh coffee, adding her own thoughts to the conversation. "My grandmother makes the best dumplings I've ever tasted. She's always saying she wishes she could teach people her recipes before they're forgotten." The energy in the restaurant had shifted completely. What had started as a tense confrontation about discrimination had blossomed into something unexpected. a genuine conversation about how to make their corner of the world a little bit better. Through the window, Mrs. Chen could see more families arriving for brunch, some hesitating at the door just as her family had done earlier. But now the manager was hurrying to welcome them, his smile reaching his eyes. The chef poked his head out of the kitchen, waving at her children who were still practicing their crepe-flipping gestures. This, she realized, was the true power of ownership. Not just having your name on paper, but having the ability to create spaces where change could take root and grow. Every person who walked through those doors today would leave with more than just a good meal. They would leave with a story about how one Sunday morning, a restaurant became more than just a place to eat. 6 weeks had passed since that transformative Sunday morning, and La Maison had become a very different place. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, watching the Sunday brunch crowd with quiet satisfaction. The dining room buzzed with a mix of languages and laughter, the sounds of a truly welcoming space. The manager, who had chosen growth over resignation, was leading a tour for a group of high school students interested in restaurant careers. And this, she heard him say proudly, is where I learned my most important lesson about hospitality. It's not about fancy tablecloths or expensive wines. It's about making everyone feel like they belong. In the corner, the chef's weekly cooking class was in full swing. Today's lesson was about fusion cuisine, combining classical French techniques with dishes from around the world. Mrs. Chen's children had become regular participants, but they weren't alone anymore. The class had grown to include kids from all over the city, their parents watching proudly from nearby tables. My grandson made dinner for us last night, an elderly customer told Mrs. Chen as she stopped by their table. He learned it right here in that cooking class. First time in my life I've had French-style stir-fried vegetables. She chuckled, patting Mrs. Chen's hand. This place has become such a gift to our community. The restaurant's transformation had rippled out in unexpected ways. Other restaurant owners in the area had started asking questions, noticing the positive changes. The local newspaper had run a story about La Maison's community programs, featuring photos of the chef teaching children how to knead bread dough and the manager mentoring new staff members. Near the kitchen, a wall that once held generic art now displayed photographs of community events, cooking classes, cultural celebrations, staff family dinners. The images told a story of connection and growth, of barriers broken down one meal at a time. The young waitress who had mentioned her grandmother's dumplings was now hosting monthly Heritage Kitchen events, where local grandparents shared their traditional recipes with eager learners. Today, an elderly gentleman was demonstrating how to make his family's special bread, his weathered hands guiding younger ones through the motions of shaping dough. "You've created something special here," Mrs. Chen's husband said, joining her at the doorway. He had just finished chatting with a group of international students who had become regular customers. Remember how nervous they were the first time they came in? Now look at them. The students were laughing with the manager, teaching him phrases in their native languages. He had started keeping a small notebook of greetings in different languages, determined to make every guest feel welcomed from the moment they walked in. Even the menu had evolved. While the classic French dishes remained, they had been joined by special fusion creations inspired by the community. Today's special was a croissant filled with spiced curry chicken, a collaboration between the chef and a local home cook who had shared her family's recipe. The restaurant's reservation policy had changed too. While they still took bookings, they always kept tables open for walk-in guests. "You never know who might need a place to belong today," the manager had said while implementing the new system. Mrs. Chen watched as a new family hesitated at the entrance, looking uncertain. Before she could move, her children rushed to greet them. "You're going to love it here," her daughter said warmly. "Would you like to see how they make crepes? The chef is the best teacher ever." The mother in the family relaxed visibly, touched by the children's welcome. This was the real change, Mrs. Chen thought, not just in policies or programs, but in hearts and minds. The restaurant had become a place where kindness was served alongside the food, where dignity wasn't just a word, but a lived experience. Through the window, she could see more people approaching, some dressed in their Sunday best, others in casual clothes. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that they would all find the same warm welcome, the same respect, the same chance to be part of this growing community. 1 year had passed since that pivotal Sunday morning. Le Maison was celebrating its anniversary not just as a restaurant, but as a symbol of what change could look like. The dining room was filled to capacity, but it wasn't the usual anniversary crowd. Instead, it was a beautiful mix of every part of the community that had become part of the restaurant's story. The manager stood at the front, giving a speech that would have been unimaginable a year ago. His voice was steady and clear, filled with genuine emotion. When Mrs. Chen first gave me a choice between resignation and change, I almost took the easy way out. But staying, learning, and growing has been the best decision of my life. Around the room, people nodded in agreement. There was the elderly couple who had witnessed that first morning of change, now regular participants in the Heritage Kitchen events. The international students who had found a home away from home, teaching staff new words every week. The high school students who had started as wide-eyed cooking class participants and were now part-time apprentices in the kitchen. The chef emerged from the kitchen, flour still dusting his apron. "You know," he said, taking the microphone, "I've been cooking for 40 years, but this past year has taught me more than all the others combined. Every recipe we've learned from our community members, every fusion dish we've created together. It's all proof that when we open our hearts and our kitchens, amazing things happen." Mrs. Chen's children sat at a table with their friends, a diverse group that had formed through the weekend cooking classes. They were sharing a giant dessert platter, each item representing a different cultural tradition that had become part of Le Maison's expanded menu. Her son was explaining to a new friend how to properly hold a crepe pan, using the same gestures the chef had taught him a year ago. The young waitress who had first mentioned her grandmother's recipes now managed the restaurant's community outreach program. She had created a calendar of events that celebrated different cultural holidays, turning the restaurant into a space where everyone could share their traditions. "Next week," she announced excitedly, "we're hosting our first community cookbook launch. Every recipe has a story, and every story matters." Through the windows, the street outside was busy with people peering in curiously. The restaurant's reputation had grown, not just for its food, but for its atmosphere of genuine welcome. Other business owners in the area had started following their example, creating their own community programs and inclusive policies. Mrs. Chen's husband squeezed her hand as they watched their daughter help serve desserts to elderly guests. "Remember when we wondered if buying this place was the right decision?" he whispered. "Look at what it's become." The manager approached their table, carrying a special anniversary cake. But this wasn't just any cake. It was a fusion creation that told their story. Layers of traditional French pastry alternated with flavors from around the world, topped with the fresh berries that had started it all. "Before we cut the cake," the manager said, addressing the room, "I want to share something. A year ago, I thought I knew what running a fine restaurant meant. I thought it was about exclusivity, about keeping some people in and others out. Mrs. Chen taught me that true excellence isn't about who you keep out, it's about who you welcome in." The room erupted in applause, and Mrs. Chen felt tears in her eyes. This was more than she had ever dreamed possible when she bought the restaurant. It had become a model for what business could be, not just a place to make money, but a force for positive change in the community. As the cake was being served, she watched her children teaching other kids how to properly hold their forks the French way, giggling as they practiced together. The future would be different for them, she realized. They had seen firsthand how barriers could be broken, how prejudice could be transformed into understanding, how one small restaurant could help change the way people saw each other. The setting sun cast a warm glow through the windows, illuminating the happy faces of everyone inside. Le Maison had become more than just a restaurant. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that change was possible. One meal, one conversation, one person at a time.